Hey Austin, thanks so much for joining us. This has been long overdue, like we said, to have a chat and just discuss our own approaches. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Of course, thanks for having me again. I know we've chatted through text back and forth, but this is long overdue, and I'm excited.
Perfect. Yeah, just to give everyone listening now a background of how this came to be. Like obviously, like you said, we've been chatting back and forth a lot over Instagram about our different posts and thought processes. And for me personally, I was telling you before we began here, I kind of have no desire to take any courses from people that claim to know the magic way of doing things, they claim to have the approach. But I'm much more interested in people sharing their unique thought processes and their decision-making framework to guide them through rehab. And that's what I love about your page and your work. And I see lots of similarities with both our approaches. And that's why I was really, interested in having a discussion with you and learning more about your approach. And this is not going to be kind of me asking you questions. We're going to be having a little bit of back and forth about different topics, our opinions on certain features in rehab.
So I know you just said process, but one of the similarities that I presume we have, and this is where I want to ask you is, would you say you're more process oriented or outcome oriented with your client work?
I think I use the outcomes to guide the process in a strange
Yeah,
kind of way because
yeah.
when a client comes to see me, I want to know what they want to get better at, and so I have an endpoint goal, and then for me the art almost of rehab is designing the in between, the
hmm
processes that you have to go through to get to that point. You know.
Yeah, no, I love that. I thought you would say that just because, I work a lot more with athletes, and so I hear this trope all the time of like trust the process, trust the process. But
Yeah.
I think that that can be extremely misleading for people when they don't question it. If it's not leading toward the outcome that you want, and we see this all the time with um, some of the more outdated or old school rehab of like, yeah, just keep doing your clamshells. You got to trust the process. Like your hip is going to take a while to get stronger. Um, where you and I are just like, well, it's not getting results, and haven't seen that, so let's try something different.
Yeah, and I think a large part of what creates that issue is the practitioner not knowing how or why they've arrived at the decision to do a clamshell.
Yeah.
If you walk up to them in a clinical situation and saying, "Well, why are you doing that?" They probably won't even know. And then the issue is that, like, if that doesn't work, then what do you do? What's plan B?
So I've been thinking about this a lot, and I feel like as much as I've wanted to put the responsibility on the practitioner, I think part of it is the work schedule that most people have to abide by, where when you're working 9 to 5 and seeing 10 or 15 people a day, that energy to try to think through why am I choosing this clamshell or not, it becomes unsustainable, so expensive. Like, and I want to encourage listeners or people who are self-employed, like I want to see the industry shift toward fewer clients per day so that practitioners and coaches have more energy to think through a quality process.
No, I agree. I worked in that system in the US for many years, and yeah, it's impossible to really understand the deeper details of why you're doing something when you have like two or three people at the same time.
Yep.
And yeah, you kind of just lean on, what generally works. You have hip pain, let's do some clamshells, let's just generally get some load into the area, and let's do some functional exercises on top of that then. I think what happens though is, for me at least, when I was working in that situation, in that environment, I didn't really kind of step back and try to adjust things as soon as I probably could. Like when things were clear that they weren't working, I just continued to push them down that path. Like you said, just trust the process. But I
hmm
think that there's a certain point where you have to kind of step back and say, okay, well, that's not working. Let's be honest, it's not working, and let's be open to adjusting things and moving in a slightly different direction. And that's scary for a lot of practitioners because you almost have to admit that your plan A didn't work. And
Yeah.
so that's a lot of practitioners almost kind of think that that makes them weak in such a way. But for me, at least where I am now in my career, it starts off with how you actually frame the rehab plan. If you frame it in such a way where we're going to be kind of doing some safe experiments, seeing how the body responds, working towards your goals, and we may have to adjust things. But if you're saying to the client, okay, this is what we need to do, you need a clamshell, you need to get stronger in your hip, and then it doesn't work, then you look like a fool when you have to change things eventually,
Yeah.
you know.
So what's two things? What's in there? First question is, did you start, were you willing to look at plan B or acknowledge your failure when you were employed or when you were self-employed?
When I was employed, I even looked, I was doing this
Impressive.
even prior to when I
Yeah.
graduated.
Okay.
But again, I got into certain methods that I just tried to kind of force a bit too much. And then after that was because they were more kind of mechanical in nature, using certain exercises, but more of a case where you're looking at patterns. You know, like you
Hmm.
kind of subgroup clients and say, oh, this client has this pain, this limitation, try this, and this in this sequence, and it should work.
Hmm.
We weren't really given, at least in school or the courses that I took at that time, the ability to kind of adapt and adjust. And that's what was missing. And for me personally, then I actually took a huge shift and I went into the neuro world and I was starting looking at things from the top down, which confused me, confused my clients. I got some cool results temporarily, but then I kind of came
Hmm.
back into more of the, I suppose you can say the biomechanical realm, but just putting a lot more emphasis on the decision making underpinning
Hmm.
what I was
Do
doing.
you know if are you familiar with a paper called forget exactly what it is, but it's basically talking about different fields where reckless deviation is rewarded versus mindless conformity. Are you familiar with this paper?
No.
It's about decision making. I'll
Mm.
send it over later. If anybody else types into Google Scholar reckless deviation and mindless conformity, it'll come up. But what it talks about is that depending on the field that you're in, it is really useful to trust a process. But I think when you were working with something, I hate using this word, but as complex as the human body and brain, you can't just like you have to deviate, you have to explore, you have to try different solutions, and that itself becomes the process with so many different things.
Mm.
Um, Whereas, like, I see it as with trusting the process is once you have found the right solution, you're seeing evidence and getting that feedback that you and I both rely on that you have found the right process. Then it's like, okay, now we know it takes like 12 weeks for a tendon to start becoming more dense. And so we're seeing improvement. And so therefore that process then has evidence to be trusted.
Mm. No, I
Anyway,
like
that's
that.
what I got from that paper.
Yeah, but I think you brought up a good point there as well. And I think what a lot of physiotherapists, especially, get, I wouldn't say confused, but like what challenges a lot of physiotherapists is kind of when to trust that process. Because if, for example, you are trying to change pain, if you're trying to modify symptoms, you kind of want to kind of get feedback quite quickly. You want to do something and see how it feels, do something, see how it feels. And it kind of gets really messy because you start just throwing stuff at the body and seeing what happens. But if you're trying to build like the capacity of a tendon, for example, or the muscular tissue, then I think you could trust that process for a bit longer because you're expecting it to take more time.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? So
Yeah,
like,
the expectations change.
yeah, you
Yeah.
don't need that faster feedback.
Hmm.
And so I think that needs, at least with the way you kind of we work with practitioners, that's one of the key things we want to address. Like you have to be clear. Are you trying to change symptoms here? Like change pain? Because there's lots of ways you can change pain. You give someone a back massage, it'll feel great. But was that was the reason they have pain the fact that they're not getting enough massages? No, it's messy. It's messy.
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
problem is that so many things can change pain, but there's very few things that can actually change the capacity of a tendon or a muscle. And not enough people, I think, appreciate that.
So the other question that I have for you is more of a personality trait or psychological quirk, because in order for you and I to use failure as data instead of an attack on, oh my God, my clamshell didn't work. Like, are they going to think badly of me? The little I know as an armchair psychologist, like you and I have to separate our title and our job from who we are, and attacks on our identity, because I think a lot of the insecurities we see in our industry is people will conflate a failed clamshell for a failure as a person. So how did you always have that division between your work and yourself, or was that a process?
That was a process for me. I used to kind of take home failures with me at nighttime. I think it drove me towards kind of being curious at the beginning. Um,
Mhm.
but I think once you do it enough and you learn from enough smart people, much smarter than me, that have the same challenges as you. I think there's a lot of benefit in just knowing that other people have the same challenges. Like nobody will have 100% success rate. And if you
Yeah.
understand that, it just makes you kind of just chill out a little bit and not to put so much, not to attach your identity to the success
Hmm.
of your clients. Because at the end of the day, like they're coming to see you with so. I think once I kind of got into the psychosocial side of things a lot, I just realized that look, it's almost impossible to change someone's behavior. You know, how much impact can we have on someone's long-term behavior? And so you kind of detach yourself away from the results in such a way, and you just get engaged in more of a kind of trial and error process. Let's just see what happens and go from there.
Hmm.
And it kind of has helped me an awful lot with, yeah, not being too down in the dumps for not helping someone. Because every single day, I have clients that I work with every single day that I can't help, and I have clients
Hmm.
that I work with every single day that I can help, that haven't had help or seen results from other practitioners. But I think there's something about knowing that from other practitioners, because that's what younger practitioners are searching for. They want that
Hmm.
100% success rate, and
Yeah.
it's going to create a burnout. I think for me, I created a lot of burnout very early on in my career because I felt as though I wasn't getting the results that other practitioners were. But then social
Hmm.
media plays such a massive role in that as well, because everybody shouts their successes from the rooftops, but they keep their
Hmm.
failures kind of just in the background, you know. So
Yeah.
for me, it was a process to try and work through that. It's a painful process. You have to realize it yourself, and you can't, as a younger practitioner, we were chatting about this before, the first course you take, you know, it's going to be just information, but you're always going to kind of think about what else is out there. You have to go through the process and learn what works for you, and it could take years to
Hmm.
learn what works for you, and lots of ups and downs. But I think you have to put yourself through that.
Oh,
Were you were
I
you the
completely agree.
same? Were you the same when you first started out?
I I was just relentlessly outcome oriented from sports, and I cared a lot about the people that I worked with, but also just like, if I want to make it, if I want my business to continue, like I have to be delivering on these results. And so I would go to course after course and after course, and they're advertised and promised as like miracles. I'm like, oh yeah, if they just move perfectly, um, they'll never get hurt, or their pain will go away. And I just never found that to be true, or it just didn't hold up with the athletic population I was working with. That, okay, let's say a clamshell did help in a isolated setting and changed how somebody felt or whatever, but then they go back to their sport and they're in pain, or they're chronically straining their hamstring. And so, eventually I'm like, wow, what I'm doing is not helping. Like, I need to do something differently. And this might be just where I'm a little bit more risk tolerant than most people. And it's like, well, fuck it. Sorry if I can't curse, but um, I'm just going to figure it out. And I love the innovation process. And as much as I hate like not solving problems, I do love the ownership and the information I gather from those repetitive failures. Where like, okay, now I can find out what really works. And again, it comes back to this problem solving process where, yeah, we might not help somebody every single day, but I think I would trust myself and trust you to go home and in the next week, like, but I know what to do differently. I know how to
Yeah.
go down a process of elimination.
Mm, absolutely. You brought up an interesting point there, and it's kind of related to one of the topics I wanted to discuss with you, and that's the idea of making someone move perfectly, almost focusing on the way someone is moving. And I think that confuses a lot of practitioners in our industry now because I think a lot of the different methods out there, different approaches claim to know how someone should move. And it kind of pushes practitioners down a path of trying to make things functional, trying to kind of get the whole body moving in the correct combination of muscle actions and joint actions. And that's what I really liked about your approach is that you understand that there's a time and a place for that, but also we need to kind of make things a bit more granular and maybe look at the capacity of the hamstring to handle forces, the capacity of the glute to handle forces. And that for some people may seem like it's a bodybuilding approach. It's not functional. How can that translate onto the field or into the real world environment? Is that something that you've had to learn through trial and error as well?
Yeah, and it's again, I coming from this like big air quotes here, functional, perfect movement thing. It was like everything must be a compound movement.
Mm.
Everything must involve three joints. And, there's a few like critical moments where, I'm talking shit on clamshells right now, but one day years ago, I'm like, yeah, but everyone should be able to do a clamshell. Like if they can't do one, then fine, give it to them. And then I started digging into some systems stuff and just thinking about a system being the sum of its parts and understanding that with some variability and complexity stuff that the more movement options someone has, usually the better they quote unquote function or the more capacity that they have. And so in my mind, I think about, disassembling a complex movement and polishing one piece of it, like the hamstring, and then maybe putting it back into a compound movement like a squat or a sprint or whatever. And that can change how people feel. It might change how they move. Um, and the third piece of the puzzle that undid my illusion of perfect movement solves everything, is seeing athletes who move like garbage, healthy, year after year after year after year. And I just like, I assume then that they must have the capacity for that quote unquote bad movement because
Mm.
they are always healthy.
Yeah. And it's one of the first things I learned on a course is that you should never put strength on top of dysfunction. Have you ever heard that saying before?
Oh yeah, that was one of my like early mantras. Like
Yeah,
never ever make a dysfunction stronger.
yeah,
And like think critically about that. It sounds great. Yeah, why would I want to make something worse?
yeah. But for me, like when I think about that as well, is like that requires you to have the belief that you know better than the person's brain. You know better than the complex system out of which
Hmm.
movement emerges. And I think it's just such a dishonest belief. When I think about that now, it's so dishonest to say that you think you know what a dysfunction is, because you could equally say that you're actually making that dysfunction more tolerant to stress, meaning you're raising its capacity, you're raising its ceiling of tolerance, so they can actually still express that dysfunction without
Yeah,
any
so they could do it more.
interference. Yeah, you just do it more. You're exposing it in a way, and so
Yeah.
you can. It's it's when you step back and kind of because you had the same experience where you kind of dug into complex systems and dynamic systems, and it's really interesting because people will still dig into that and still think that that out of that we should be training more functional movement because movement is very complex. It emerges from a very complex system, so we should be focusing on not on the individual components but how the whole system works together. But I think that's
Mhm.
people from the functional side of things, having just learned about dynamic systems theory, and now thinking, okay, how can I bring those two things together to still keep my functional method alive? And they've come up with
Yeah.
that. And
Yeah.
it gets really messy because for me, what I see clinically, and I'm sure you've seen it, I've seen it on your Instagram, how you kind of you talk about the negative effects of this, is that you could have someone avoiding a certain joint action or muscular action for years and years and years that come to see you with an issue. And you could teach them a different way of moving that might make them feel better, but you're just teaching them a different way of avoiding the local area. And so
Mhm.
you're not really helping them, you're just actually shrinking their movement variability in just a different way.
Yeah.
You know?
No, I'm right there with you. And like the maybe ultimate truth I think you and I are both after is restoring, let's say, a hip's innate variability. Like I just want it to be able to do all the things. I want all the adductors to be able to flex, internally rotate, extend, whatever. Like the I want them to be able to do all their jobs. And I think what's paired with this is I'm thinking about a football player, an offensive lineman that I have worked with, and he came to me with groin pain. And the way I understand his problem after solving it is that he really didn't like lengthening his adductors. And I gave him the capacity. He could start having that capacity at length and expressed it in all the different rotational abilities that a hip can. His pain went away. But
But it can't be that
still,
simple. It can't be that simple. That's what people will say. It can't be that
yeah.
simple than just lengthening
But
it and putting load in it. But it can.
well, so this is where it is. It once you go through this trial and error process, then it becomes very elegant. It's a very elegant solution where I
Mm.
can say something that specific, right? He didn't want to lengthen his adductors and specifically his pectineus when it was isolated to flex his hip, externally rotate, and adduct. And I gave him that capacity. Everything felt great.
Mm.
But what I think the interesting thing is the skill acquisition side, where his brain is a prediction engine, and he knows how to block a defensive lineman with quote unquote a valgus collapse because that's what he was taught. So this is like this pre-programmed software. I'm like, well, he's still showing like that this this process, but I think it's not anymore because he doesn't want to lengthen his adductors. It's because this
Mm.
is how his brain knows how to orchestrate movement. And then we're back to the top of like, wow, this is really messy.
Yeah, yeah. But I think it's an honest approach. I said that tongue in cheek, like, it couldn't be that simple because a lot of people will say to us, it can't be that simple. My job's more important than that. Like I should, I went through school for this many years to kind of to think I
Yeah.
know, exactly how a human should move. It can't be that simple to just look more locally. But the
Well, of
thing,
course, Ryan, like it needs, and then you forgot to mention that if his hip is crooked, his pelvis is dropped, it's probably going to create some sort of cervical pain. You
yeah,
know,
oh yeah,
there's got to be this really complex interaction between his jaw and his.
well, did you not check his feet? Did you not
I
check
didn't
his
check
feet?
his feet alignment. You know, I didn't draw
Well,
lines
yeah,
on him.
it's only a matter
I
of
should
time until
probably
that comes
quit
back.
now.
It's only a matter of time
Yeah.
until that groin comes back. But this is what a lot of those camps create. Like
Right.
it almost
Yeah.
you go to things without having any clear reason why you're doing it in the first place. Your approach there just makes sense. It's honest, and on top of that as well, you don't really. And this is what I like about it. It doesn't really require you to make overly complex or to have overly complex explanation as to why it happened or why it helped. You just gave the system the ability to handle load through that area, and you
Right.
respect that there's some intelligence within his nervous system to get to then integrate that. Like you cut your leg, you have something wrong, like your body sorts it out. Your body has some intelligence. It can do its job. It doesn't need you to hold its hand and do everything for it.
Yeah.
But for some reason in the rehab industry, we think we do have to hold its hand and do everything for
Well, it makes us valuable.
it.
You know, if we're always necessary for the client, then we're safe. We're
Yeah.
going to keep getting paid, and we feel good. Uh, but I want to know what your favorite, because I always get the answer of like, well, why? I want to know what your favorite answers are for that, because this is another alignment where we're at. It's like, I don't know why. I don't really care
Mm. For like why it helped in that situation almost.
why it helped or why it started in the first place.
Yeah. For me, like obviously it's a very complex question and answer. What I always do is I give the client multiple explanations. I give them at least
Mm,
three. I
okay.
don't use one, I give them two or three. Like this, it could be this, it could be this, it could be this. We don't know. I don't overwhelm them with like 10 or 15, 20 different explanations. But I think giving them at least three um, kind of affords them the ability to know that it's not just one thing. Because I think if we tell them it's one thing, you can almost kind of plant the message in their brain that, okay, if I don't take care of that one thing, this could come
Yeah.
back and it can create a little bit of kinesiophobia down the road.
Hmm.
But in terms of why it happened in the first place, there's lots of layers to that because I think you can have an issue that is perpetuating a pain experience that didn't necessarily cause it in a way. You know,
Hmm.
that could have been like kick-started by, you know, a tweak in the hip or a little injury in the hip, and the way his body reacted to it in a very unique way is the thing that is perpetuating the problem. But the cause is just, let's say he fell on his hip in a game, you know, and
Yeah.
then the way his body reacted to it, the unique, maybe he went to see a practitioner that told him something silly and he kind of responded in a very unique way. And his response to that thing is what's actually perpetuating the issue. And that's why I tell clients, like, who knows why it happened? Does it really matter? Because all we can do here and now is just deal with what is actually presented to us in a way. And that's
Yeah.
why I think this approach that we're both using is the best way because it's just an honest way of doing things.
Yeah, no, I've got a shit-eating grin because you're taking a lot of the words out of my mouth. You know, I'm like, oh, I don't know why it happened. Maybe you fell when you were 7. Like,
Yeah.
doesn't
Yeah.
matter. It
Yeah.
works, didn't it?
Yeah. People want that certainty. People,
Yeah.
clients do want labels. And so sometimes I will give them some labels, but not one label. You know, I'll say it could be this, could be this, could be this. And what the benefit in that as well is that if you go down, let's say you've got three things it could be, and you go down pathway number one and it doesn't work, at least you can say, okay, well, let's work on this other pathway. But if you're so certain that it's this one thing and it doesn't work, then you just look foolish.
Mm,
Then you may have to still adjust and adapt, but then the client's lost trust in you. You weren't clear with them from the beginning that it could be a couple of different things. You were just overly certain about one reason. You know, it's just it reflects a need to be just comfortable with uncertainty.
mhm.
But like you were saying before we kind of got on this call, people don't have a plan B, plan C, plan D. They just have a plan A. When plan A doesn't work, what happens then? It gets
More
messy.
reps,
More reps. Yeah, just trust the
more reps.
process. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think a lot of
just
the
get
time,
stronger.
yeah, the client just kind of slowly kind of just work like doesn't work with that client anymore. And so it's
Yeah.
almost like I think, at least for me, when I was working as a young physio in New York City and dealing with like three, four people at the same time, when things weren't working out, I would just kind of hope that the client wouldn't come back. So I wouldn't have to deal with it. You know, so that they
Yeah,
would just almost not come back. And
yeah.
in a way it was kind of forcing me not to reflect on things, but eventually I felt, okay, I have to reflect on this now. Like you were saying before, you have to go home and understand, well, why is it not working? And it pushes you to learn from smarter people and develop, your own unique approach then.
Well, also without them coming back, you don't get feedback. I know you and I both love feedback, and so like
Exactly.
if
Yeah.
if an athlete flew out to me for a week and it was incredibly successful, and like I text them a little bit for the few months after, and everything's still good, it's still in the back of my mind. Like I almost wait a year sometimes, and I'm like, are we still good? Like, did that really solve it?
Yeah.
Um, because I just want to. It's not. I don't want to be going after certainty. It's just like I need. I want to sharpen my sword and get that feedback of like, yes, that is the solution for him.
Yeah. I think as well, it just reduces the variability within your own approach as well, because you just focused on the adductor. Okay, can you adduct? That's kind of one variable. There's lots of ways, obviously, you can tweak that. You can change pelvis, you can change femoral rotation, but you're just looking at adduction. And so if things don't work, at least you know probably they might not need more adductor loading. And so then you can kind of check that box and go on to something else. But when you
Yep.
start throwing loads of things at the body, different functional tasks where there's lots of variables. There could be some adduction, some flexion, some things above and below. If things don't work, then it's almost like you don't have any kind of clear data at that point
Yes.
to make a decision on what to do next then. And so I think that's why
Yes.
starting simple is so, at least check that box, at least make sure they can adduct,
Yeah.
in that situation. They can adduct at length, and then if they can, great. Then move on to the more complex thing if you want, but don't just skip over that because you want to be smarter than the client's brain.
Right. Like you have to go up chain or down chain. And I think you and I also agree from a dynamic systems perspective. Like, no, in my experience, the greatest probability of finding a solution is like directly where the pain and the problem is. And I don't want to conflate things by thinking about like, well, the interactions between the foot and the hip. And I know this is another point that we agree on, and maybe, kicking a dead horse for our audience, but like, I will never understand the mental hoops to jump through. And maybe I'm just too stupid, but like, I don't understand how somebody's foot is going to impact their neck. Like every joint further away, you can't convince me that force is being communicated in such a way to cause something at the neck all the way down from the foot.
Mm. Yeah, I think that gets into one of the points I wanted to discuss with you, and that's kind of using biomechanics within our approach. Do you want to go ahead and do you want to kind of touch on something else, something unique?
No, I just want us to like, I don't know what biomechanics means anymore
Mm. Yeah.
because, so I want to just ground the conversation. How do you define biomechanics?
For me, it's a field of study. It's a model of movement that describes movement. For me, we don't improve it. We just use it to make sense of load application. Right. So I kind of use biomechanics in terms of how the different components of the body interact with each other, how forces move through the system. From
Okay, so more
a
of the
descriptive.
traditional.
Yeah, I use very traditional biomechanics because
Yeah, yeah,
much smarter people than me have been through the process and created this model. So for me,
yeah.
it's like it just acts as a filter to guide to filter what I'm doing, why I'm doing it. It informs me of kind of how I'm doing things. And I think with that example there, within biomechanics, you've kind of two general kind of components. You've got the kinematics, which is the understanding of how, different components of the system are positioned in space and relative to each other. And then you have the kinetics, which describes the forces that create those positions, create those motions. I think when people use the foot as a way to explain why people have issues up the chain, they're overly focusing on the kinematic side of things and not enough on the forces. Because yes, when
Mhm.
you pronate your foot, it is going to have an influence on the tibia, right? And when the tibia moves, it probably will have a little bit of an influence on the femur. And then people say, okay, when the femur moves, it must have an influence on the pelvis, and then that must have an influence on the lumbar spine, and that must have an influence on the thoracic spine. But it's not a real accurate representation of movement.
Energy dissipates is the
Exactly,
problem.
that's the thing. Yeah, it
Yeah.
becomes distributed and it kind of loses its effect as it moves further up the chain. But it's when people overly focus on the directions of movement. For example, when my femur internally rotates, yes, it could drag the pelvis in the same direction with it, but it doesn't have to, is the thing. In real world movements, you don't move through a full range of motion. So your femur can
Mhm.
move without having any influence on the pelvis. Your pelvis can move without having any influence on the thoracic spine. Your thoracic
Mhm.
spine can move without having any real influence on the cervical spine as well. It certainly
Right.
can, but it doesn't always have to. And that's the problem is people assume that people will have this issue. Oh, you can't pronate. You must not be able to do this at the knee. You must not be able to do this at the hip. You must not be able to do this at the lumbar spine, thoracic spine, and then as a result, you must not be able to do this at the neck. And so let's get that foot motion back, and then voila, everything changes.
Exactly. So let's keep using the foot as an example. And I think of it in terms of joint position, but also capacity and attacks. And the general heuristics that I work with is like a longer tissue is going to be more expensive than a shorter tissue. And so let's say somebody substitutes their motion from their ankle into their arch, and they have a quote unquote flat foot and they overpronate. Maybe I want to shorten up their posterior tib. Maybe I would love to get them more accurate motion at their ankle. And I might try to do that so that they have a more economical task in front of them, especially if that they're having to run 6, 7 miles a day for their game. But as we know and have discussed, like it's really hard to change movement. And so if I can't do that, then all right, well, tissue adapts. Like let me give it this capacity at these longer lengths to afford the movement that the brain is already programmed to be doing, that they already know how to do. And so this goes into I don't want to say strengthening the dysfunction because that's not how I think about it. It's like I know that let's just use posterior tib and as an example, like that tissue is going to be extra long. Do they have the capacity to have it long? Do they have the capacity at their tendon to handle that change of direction force over and over and over every day? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I think that kind of highlights one of the big, like the counter arguments for a lot of things, in the sense that, okay, if you have a flat foot, yeah, your posterior tib might be long and it may or may not have the ability to shorten. They may still have the ability to do that, but for whatever reason, they're not engaging with that during movement. And so you could step back and say, okay, well, maybe let's make the posterior tib shorter to not have the posterior tib only experiencing load at longer lengths. But we could also say that maybe it just needs to raise its ceiling, its capacity ceiling to handle force in that longer length. And I think that's where the individual is important, because the individual that presents to you with that complaint is very important, because they could be someone that's very sedentary, and all of a sudden they decide to start running, 5Ks, 10Ks, and all of a sudden their foot blows up and they come to see you and say, oh, my arch is sore. Okay, well, how do we address this? We may just have to raise the capacity of everything.
Right.
Compared to someone who's very strong, very active, engaging with things and with forces for a long period of time, and then they come to see you with this issue. Maybe it's a case where that posterior tib can handle forces in that longer length position, but they're always using that as a strategy, in which case a part of the solution there would be to afford some more variability in the foot. Just give the brain the experience of the posterior tib experiencing load in a shortened position. Maybe that lets the longer length position calm down. We don't know. But for me, that's a more reasonable explanation if someone's already very active, very strong, has a high capacity. Does that make sense?
No, I 100%. And that's where I might change my hierarchy of things, where as I'm doing my intake, I might hear them say like, yeah, I just bought some new running shoes and I wanted to start training for this 10K. And so I just started running 3 or 4 times a week and now my feet are killing me. And if you look at their feet and you see that they're just awful and very flat, I think it's very seductive for the practitioner to be like, oh my God, okay, well, we got to fix your arch. And I just learned this like really fancy thing from a foot course and we got to do this. When for me, the bigger priority is like, well, you also did just like spike your volume and you haven't done anything for the last year. So like, let's forget about the more complicated foot stuff. We'll cross that. That'll be plan B or plan C. But for now, like, let's just give you a better on ramp with your volume.
Yeah.
I think this is, as I'm talking about this, there is a few things where I might be a little bit more stubborn in my approach. And it's with running and jumping athletes who have what I call a false plantar flexion.
Mm.
Um, can I share my screen?
Sure. Yeah.
All right. So on the guy on the left here, what I hope you and everybody else will see, or what I will hopefully describe well, is I use skin in the back of the Achilles to demonstrate how much the soleus and gastroc hold on the heel, as that should shorten this length, and there should be a wrinkle here.
Mhm.
And when I watch how he plantar flexes, it seems to be all first MTP plantar flexion.
Mhm.
His heel is significantly high off the ground here, and there are still no wrinkles in his Achilles. This has been corroborated with the fact that his foot would cramp even if blankets laid on his foot and put him into toe flexion. And he had almost no muscle size. And this is a guy who runs several miles 6 days a week for his sport. This is where I get a little bit more stubborn, where I want this movement quality and capacity to improve, um, where I need to see that plantar flexion improve more accurately, because I think that indicates the capacity of his soleus and gastroc to truly shorten and pull on his calcaneus. Does that illuminate some of the biomechanics question?
Yes. So sorry, I just kind of lost it there for just a second.
Yeah, I turned it off
You turned it off.
for the
Okay.
sure.
Um, yeah, I think when you're looking at that stuff, that's where you have to be clear on the issue the client is coming to see you with, and not having a perfect, like not only relying on a perfect way to plantar flex, but giving them options to plantar flex. Like that's probably a fine way to plantar flex, but is that the only way they can plantar flex? And does that
Yeah, so
reflect
that was
how they're
the
actually?
only way
That was the only way,
for him.
exactly.
For
Yeah.
him, yeah, yeah,
And,
yeah.
and then that means, okay, well, maybe they're, for me at least, the way I would think about that is, okay, that's great, but in the task that they're having difficulty with, for example, does that warrant other options in which to load the ankle plantar flexors? And do they have that ability? Or are they being constrained into this one way of doing things? For me,
I think
that's
he
where,
was constrained because he would get Luco tape around his ankle
yeah,
pre-game.
yeah. And for me, that's where movement variability comes into play. And
Mhm.
for me, like there's a few ways to kind of think about that because sometimes in at least the way I work, I almost think of it as just providing the nervous system with experiences instead of trying to change the way someone moves. Because I've had plenty of situations where a client will move in a certain way, and I'll say, okay, well, that doesn't look fantastic, but it was their first rep of that movement. I mean, if I ask them to move in another way, they can do it. They can actually move in many different ways, but the way they're just self-selecting
Yeah,
doesn't look great. Do you know what I mean? And that's where I think we can kind of get caught up sometimes, where if a practitioner kind of looks at one rep and say, oh, that's wrong, and then we say, okay, you got to do something else. But we only use the first rep instead of kind of digging a little bit deeper. Do you know what
right. So I'm truncating his story
I
into
mean?
like a bite-sized thing. I asked him to do it in open chain in other instances, and he couldn't. He still couldn't do it. So I tested it
Mm.
in multiple opportunities, and he still failed. And at the level that he strives to play at, like I want that variability, but I also think that his soleus and gastroc have more capacity, innate capacity. Did I freeze? Did I lose you?
I think it
There we go.
froze just for a moment
Um,
there.
yeah, I would still think that his soleus and gastroc have more innate capacity for plantar flexion than his short toe
Mm.
flexor, or foot intrinsics, or his peroneals. And like this is where I go in circles in my head of, well, I don't see evidence that he's loading his triceps array very
Mm.
well. He didn't have any, he didn't come to me for his foot issues. I thought this was a chance to intervene.
It was his neck.
Um, No, he came to me because one of his
Are you
teammates
joking?
was coming. But
Okay.
yeah, um, for the amount of mileage that he needs to run, I just thought like I still think it's a more prudent decision if he learns accurate plantar flexion, and that we see
Sure.
his muscle get bigger. Um, I'm fine if he's still, plantar flexus is his first met. Great, just get the calcaneus to move a little
Yeah.
bit more
Yeah.
too.
No, I agree. I agree with that. I agree with that 100%. And I think the key thing there is like you try to expose other opportunities there for him to demonstrate that instead of just using the
Mm,
first rep of the movement task. You know,
right.
that's what I kind of get. That, probably one of the biggest things that I kind of not change my mind on, but one of the things that kind of highlighted that you just got to dig deeper sometimes. And
Mm,
people have the ability to do lots of things, but do we actually give them the opportunity to do those things? Like I see it a
mm,
lot with low back pain. You ask someone to bend down towards their toes and they just keep their spine
yeah,
super straight and they hinge. And you're like, okay, you can flex your spine. But they could actually flex their spine, but they just chose not to in that
yeah,
moment. You know, but
right.
then
And
that
so
can
like,
go, no, go
what would
ahead.
you do in that instance? Like, I would be like, okay, now I want to see if you can do that by rounding your back.
Yeah, I do the same.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
cool.
And sometimes they can't do it in standing, but they can do it in sitting, for example, which then demonstrates to me that, okay, maybe they just can't do that under more coordinative situations, or under with a more coordinative challenge. Because when you're doing it in standing, for example, there is a little bit more of a balance component there. You've got to handle a bit of load through the plantar flexors, through the lower limbs a little bit. That's kind of where our approach kind of might not be different at all, but we kind of look at, okay, can you handle load locally through a joint, through a muscular tissue, a joint action, but can you also coordinate that joint action, muscular action with the neighboring joint or another area? So as an example, let's
Mm,
say that in that scenario, the client um, couldn't flex their spine in a standing position. They could flex it in a seated position. And then we also kind of take a look at the lower limbs' ability to handle forces. Maybe they have poor knee extensor loading, knee flexor loading, poor plantar flexor loading. Um, and then you might, hypothesize that, okay, well, if the lower limb can't handle force as well, that may lead to a more guarded position or a lack of variability proximally. Because then you have to consider, okay, well, where are the forces entering your system? They're entering through the
mm,
lower limbs. And so, yes, I could do a lot of local, low back movements, so some very focused low back flexion work. But then if I have them moving in the real world on top of a limb that cannot handle forces, then that presents an issue. So for me, that would be more of a coordinative issue then, where, okay, I know they can flex their spine in a seating position. They have that range of motion capacity. They may still not be able to handle forces through their lumbar flexors, their abdominals,
yeah.
but I want to see, okay, can they do that while they actually handle load through their lower limbs? And so there's a bit more of a coordinative challenge there. That's more of like how I view almost trying to kind of get people comfortable with more real world activities. I'm not going to say this is the way you need to flex your spine, but I'm just going to challenge it. Like, can you flex your spine
Mm.
as you load your quads, your hamstrings, your plantar flexors? That's kind of how the way my mind works.
Same approach, different language, in
Nice.
my head, where it's like, um, I might in my brain and not outward facing to my students, might have some dynamic systems thing, or just like, I want to increase degrees of freedom. And can they still do that? You know,
Mm.
I, and it's surprisingly effective to test your own work. So like, it reminds me of a rugby player that I saw. He tore his ACL twice and was still having issues 13 months after his second surgery. And in the gym, everything was going swimmingly. And so then when we went out onto the pitch, I wanted one of his biggest challenges was just a smooth eccentric folding of his left leg, his affected leg. And everything is going great in the gym, but as soon as he's on the grass or I put a ball in his hand, or if I'm even standing near him, like he would stiffen his leg. And this is a guy who's playing at the highest level. And so it's one of my favorite stories that reflects this, where all I had him do was just jump and land onto his left leg, but I didn't tell him. And I trusted him and our work. We had great rapport ahead of time. Like, I wouldn't do this otherwise. I would just shove him randomly to ensure that he could still absorb those forces with a good eccentric contraction without, or with all that noise and with that extra complexity.
Yeah. That's a nice kind of point to connect back to something we spoke about before, where, like with the adductor example, they could they couldn't handle load locally through the adductors, and so you had to focus on that first before maybe looking at more the real world application of how that adductor integrates with the rest of the limb. Whereas in that situation, they probably had good local capacity around the knee, but then you put them into like a more of a real world environment, and they're just not engaging with it. Like they have the
Mm-hmm.
capacity, but they're just not
Yes.
engaging with it. Yeah.
Yeah. It wasn't a movement option in his brain.
Yeah.
And so like we made it a conscious thing where it's like, no, you have to choose to move differently
Hmm.
if you're going to absorb these loads in rugby.
Yeah.
Like it has to be a conscious choice for a while.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think, but that's good because that's almost where you get into like the functional side of things,
Hmm.
kind of right. It's more like the skill-based, task-based stuff, which we were kind of poo-pooing a little bit at the beginning, but not
Yeah.
necessarily poo-pooing, but saying, okay, it's more about when you choose to do that functional stuff. Like if you try to
Yes.
change function before looking at the underlying individual capacities, that's when you can run into problems,
Agreed.
right?
Yeah. I mean, he earned the right for that. We didn't just go straight there.
Yeah, and I have an example of that as well, where I was working with a client actually, an ACL reconstruction, kind of in the middle stages, and getting really strong quadriceps, really strong ankles within the clinical environment. And I remember one day I watched them; they were doing great in the session in the clinic, and I saw them walking towards their car out the window of my clinic, and they were just walking with a stiff knee. They just immediately went defaulted to a stiff knee pattern, but they had the underlying capacities to actually bend the knee. And so one of the things that I just had to ask them to do was just sink into your knee when you walk, like really exaggerate, just flexing the knee. Just do it every time you walk. Just sink into it. Just trying to. I almost think of it as you're just trying to disrupt that pattern, that habit. Instead, I'm not trying to teach them the good way to do it. I'm trying to disrupt something that is having an influence on how that lower limb is engaging with forces. If that
Right. I
makes
mean, this is the brain pattern, the neuro pattern that I think we both agree on too. It's
sense.
like he has the underlying hardware,
Yeah.
but it still sometimes has to be a choice.
Exactly. Yeah. And when is it? When should it be the focus of rehab? I think is where I don't. Maybe it's the you could say it's the art of rehab about when to know when to focus on one thing or the other. And I think it's a perfectly fine thing to also focus on both simultaneously in some
Hmm.
situations. Sometimes you want to work on the local stuff. And let's say, for example, a client has pain when they do a certain thing. Because I see a lot of clients, I see quite a few kind of professional athletes as well, but a lot of kind of, your gen pop people that have chronic pain, movement limitations in a real world environment. I sometimes have to teach them a different way to move, but not because I think it's the best way to move, because I'm just trying to calm down symptoms. Because sometimes they're doing things that are actually provoking their pain, and they need to be taught a different strategy to use. But then I need to also ensure they have the underlying capacities to shift stress into areas that they've been avoiding. So you're kind of looking at a local thing and then more kind of a coordinated thing.
Right.
But I think people will still do that, but they'll almost think, oh, that the way I've taught you to move there feels better. That must be the right way to move. That's the problem then. If they have that belief as a result of things feeling better when they move in a different way, they think, I've just fixed the way you move. That's the perfect way to move now because you feel less pain.
Right. I also, not that any sport coaches are listening to this, but it also reminds me of some of the technique changes sport coaches might be asking their athletes to do. And it's like, well, they can't do that technique because they have no capacity for that movement.
Mm.
But
Yeah.
sport coaches is a very different conversation.
Yeah. But I think for me, that's kind of where, like coming back to your question about biomechanics, for me, that's where biomechanics is important because it actually gives you a little bit more of a framework to understand, well, how can I get load into that local area? How am I going to manipulate the vectors of force going into the tissues, into the joint to ensure that the client is loading that area and not just cheating in a way by shifting stress into a neighboring area. That's where I think having a good solid understanding of kind of the kinematics of things, how segments are organized in space
Mm-hmm.
relative to each other, the directions of force. Because sometimes you can have the exact same joint position, but the direction of force will influence what tissue gets loaded.
Quite a case that blows my mind once is a minor league baseball player. He was doing his, compound lifts, his functional lifts, lifting hundreds and hundreds of pounds. And, his squat looked very symmetrical, but when I isolated his quad, he couldn't do anything. And
Mm.
so, like, this is where I'm also just dumbfounded by uh, I think you called it the wisdom of the body. Like, somehow this dude is lifting hundreds and hundreds of pounds with a quad that can barely lift 50 pounds.
Mm. Yeah. There's a lot of research on that post ACL reconstruction.
He
Like even
wasn't an ACL guy.
it was just, yeah, like that's obviously, well, for me, I would think that's just poor management on his in his care before you, most
Mhm.
likely, right?
Oh,
Like
oops.
even in like
Sorry.
in post ACL reconstruction, even shifting the pressure into the forefoot will just engage the plantar flexors a little bit more, and that can offload the quad quite significantly when you're just giving the plantar flexors the ability to take on some of the load. Um,
Yeah, help decelerate the knee. I wish more people. I feel like this whole talk is just like worsening my confirmation bias because I feel like we agree on so much. But again, like
but we're not creating
I
any
wish.
any crazy explanations about why it's happening. I think it's a bit more kind of honest. It's more obvious. It's that's why I like your approach. It's because it's just forces. It's range of motion. It's how your body's moving through space, and it's forces. These are things we can't escape. We're not adding any
Yes.
complexity in the explanations behind it. We're just, can you take
Yeah.
forces or not?
Exactly. I love that simplicity. Again, is it really that simple?
Mhm. Because even when you look at orthopedic research, there's two main outcomes when it comes to improving someone's movement. It's the range of motion you have and how well you can generate force. Like there's not really much else. People will say, "Oh, you've got the fascia in there. Are you working the fascia?" Other things as well. They'll just add their own. They'll almost judge movement. Like, is that range of motion good or bad? It's not good or bad. It's just range of motion. That's
Yeah.
that's where I think it gets really messy in our industry, and that's one of the main reasons I wanted to sit down and have a chat with you because I know you have the same viewpoint, and I think
Mhm.
our industry should have people that have similar viewpoints have more discussions like this because I think it
Yeah.
helps.
I'm enjoying this so much, and hopefully our audiences do too, because I'd love to do this again.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think hopefully, no, I'd love to do it again, and
Yeah.
hopefully our audience will like to
Yeah.
listen to more because I think we could go much deeper into these kind of topics relative to more local body regions, looking at the ankle,
Yeah.
the knee, the hip, and things, just because I think I see you as an honest practitioner. I see myself as an honest practitioner. I don't think we will lead people down a path of claiming that we know the best way to do things. It's just, it is what it is. These are things that should be checked off during the
Yeah.
rehab process. And it's more
Yeah.
about your the framework you use. Like that's why I say it again, why I wanted to get you on a chat like this because it's your thought process that I'm more attracted to in a way. Not to
Yeah.
sound weird, but it's like the way you think. I'm so sick and tired of seeing reels and posts on Instagram. Like, here's the best exercise for back pain, for this pain. I don't care about that stuff, and I think a lot of people are fatigued with that
I
stuff.
hope so. I really hope the consumers are getting fatigued of that stuff because I am so sick of it.
Yeah, I think.
I want
Go
people
ahead.
to be in enough pain that they want a better solution than
Mhm.
like, here's my fancy foam rolling protocol for my plantar fasciitis.
Yeah. But do you know what the annoying thing is? Is that going back to one of the other topics we discussed, that can sometimes help pain, right? You can get,
I know it can.
and that's the messy thing is because it can help pain, but it doesn't mean you're actually raising your capacity ceiling for how much force you can take. And so is it
Yeah,
going to make you a better mover? Like we care about function, we care about what tasks someone can go back and do, but it's about affording them the building blocks to do those tasks, you know?
agreed. I just don't want people to think that foam rolling and their pain going away affords them solutions to go run a 5K
Yeah.
or a 10K
Hmm.
or go hike for 8 hours.
Yeah. Like the point I was trying to make there is like don't get yourself into a situation where just because something helps pain, it means that you found the cause of their pain. You know,
Hmm.
you roll on a lacrosse ball in your foot. It might feel good. Doesn't mean your lack of lacrosse ball rolling is the reason you got plantar fasciitis.
Exactly.
It's
Yeah.
it's 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 just about making better decisions and having a
Hmm.
better thought process, just being more critical of things.
Hmm. I want to be kind of selfish here, but I'm curious about, like, I was thinking about you and I had talking about the comparative anatomy stuff. Can we go that
Yeah,
direction?
sure. Yeah.
So, from everybody listening from your audience, like one of the things that I've found to be most useful and loved is just seeing how movement patterns have evolved over time and how anatomy has changed from our far ancestors to our most recent ancestors. It seems pretty fucking important to me when, like, if we look at a chimp's foot, um, there's a reason why the first metatarsal and the calcaneus became as big as they are. And like the only reason I can think of is there to take more force.
Mm.
And so this to me is more hard evidence of like when I see people go to terminal stance phase or propel off their oblique axis over their four small toes, or God forbid they're listening to one of those cult like things out there saying that you need to put weight to like peel off your fifth met. We have archaeological evidence that that isn't true. And then one of the other aspects that I find really important is then at the shoulder and the hand. But let's go to shoulder. So one of the biggest other changes within uh, mammalian evolution is where the shoulder blades and the elbows are. And so fish became reptiles and amphibians, and they had this very wide knee, wide elbow gait strategy with a ton of spinal movement, but it's not efficient. But once the elbows and the knees came underneath the body, it became efficient, and we started seeing great migrations. Where it applies to us then is what I would summarize as glenohumeral joint adduction. For arboreal primates, the shoulder blade went onto the back of the body, and we have this almost 90-degree turn of glenohumeral joint adduction for our species. And so, like, again, this seems like unavoidable importance where, sure, if somebody has a quote unquote winging scapula, like, does it need to change? I don't know. But if they're a baseball player or a volleyball player and they don't have the capacity to lengthen their rotator cuff here, or they don't have that movement option that is integral to our species, like again, that becomes a very, very big point for me from a comparative anatomy and evolutionary scale.
I like that.
Well, thank you for my TED talk.
I think that's really important though, because again, it breaks down like the fundamental reason our body is kind of designed architecturally in a certain way, or how it's evolved in a certain way. And so while that might not be like you're doing an exercise with someone, it might not be in the back of your mind, okay, like a chimp's shoulder blade was like this, but it's something that almost leads to the decision to do something or have a better understanding of human movements.
Yeah,
Does that
so
make
I want to give people systems to think through. So
Yeah.
like in the course that I talk about, I try to start with a big bucket of like, do they move like a human? Do they move like a quadruped? Or do they move like an amphibian or a reptile? Or sorry, a aquatic animal. And then from there, it's like, okay, now we can get a little more narrow. So with
Mm.
that quadrupedal style shoulder blade, then I know, well, the main movement to reintegrate is glenohumeral joint adduction. Maybe that means their pec needs to shorten more than it's ever shortened before because people wouldn't get their elbow in front of their sternum. They just bench press.
Mhm.
Or maybe they're never lengthening their posterior delt and rotator cuff. And again, and adduction, because the only way they train um, the rotator cuff is with the rotator cuff exercises that everybody knows without me saying what they are.
Mm. No, I agree. I agree.
Yeah.
I think it gets into a fundamental component of both our approaches. Like the way I think about our approach is like the when you take action, it's quite simple. You put load into the body, that's all you do. But the underlying concepts that lead to that can be very complex. It shouldn't
Yes.
be the opposite. It shouldn't be, it's really simple. And then the exercises are really complex, really complicated as well. Like that's when it's almost reversed. I'd much rather have kind of more complex concepts and ideas underpinning very simple exercise strategies, because exercises are just mechanisms for putting load into the body. But it
Mhm.
seems like when people get confused, it's flipped. It's okay, you've got to shorten whatever, you got to stretch it, or, it's just very, very simple thought concepts, but they make the exercises extremely complicated.
Well, if you think about the cognitive load, that's like we're that when you fall into that trap, we're the ones doing the simple job and we're giving the complex job to the client.
Yeah.
And they're trying to juggle 20 cues as they do this perfect movement with five different joints involved while trying to maintain their breathing. Meanwhile, we're just sitting back taking notes of like, yeah, we're just giving them the standard thing for this diagnosis. When I think it should be the other way around. Like our job as a problem solver, we are the ones who should be wearing the cognitive load, not the client.
Hmm. Hmm.
Their job is the
Absolutely.
physical load.
Yeah, exactly. No, I completely agree with that. I completely agree. I think that's a good way to finish up. What do
Yeah,
you think? I think
yeah,
I'd love I'd
it's
love to
great.
go deeper, and I think we could go a lot deeper into a lot of these concepts and break things down and also expose a lot of the those cognitive biases and a lot of the bullshit in the rehab industry currently to help younger practitioners. But you have just to kind of give people an understanding of how they can learn more about you. Like you have a mentorship or a course coming up soon.
Yeah, so I've got an online course which is 8 weeks, and the thing that I want to do the most is like I don't want to make this like any other course. I want to teach you how to apply this stuff. So that's why it's 8 weeks. 6 weeks of it is with your case studies, where it's you bring videos of your clients to class or yourself to class and your thought processes, and that's like I want to teach people how to think. I do not want to teach them protocols. I do not want to teach them a methodology. I want to improve people's brains, which is why it's 8 weeks. But if you want to just follow me on Instagram at Austin Einhorn, and then I'm rebooting my newsletter and blog, so you'll get some more long form written content there as well.
Awesome, awesome.
And
And of
then
course,
I can repost this to my audience too, right?
absolutely, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah. So
So
everybody go follow Ryan in integrated kinetic neurology because they are fucking brilliant, brilliant people.
no, I appreciate that. And like I said, I really hope we can do more of this. Like I have no, like I said at the beginning, I have no interest in speaking to people that think they have the magic method. But like you said, I'm much more interested in helping people think differently. Of course, we have unique exercises that we teach people, right? But it's more about the decision you used that allowed you to arrive at doing that exercise. That's what we're both interested in, right? And I think
Yes,
I think
absolutely.
that I think that can really help push the industry forward. So if you really enjoyed this chat, for anyone out there, please either comment below, email myself or Austin, and let us know what you thought. And if you'd like to learn more, let us know, and we can definitely we'll probably make this happen again either way, whether you liked it or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
because I think
Agreed.
it's really going to help people. Okay.
Thanks so much for having me.
No, thanks. It was a pleasure, Austin.